It was supposed to be a regular weekend, just me and my husband, Jason, getting away for some much-needed alone time. We'd been married for almost 10 years, but lately, it felt like we were just going through the motions. The spark had faded, the conversations had become routine, and even the intimacy was lacking. We both knew it, but neither of us had done much to fix it. Jason suggested a getaway, a weekend cabin retreat in the mountains, a quiet place where we could get away from everything. The stress of work, the noise of the city, and the overwhelming pressure of life. He was trying, I could see that. He was trying to get us back to where we once were. But deep down, I wasn't sure we could go back. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that this would be the thing to reignite something between us. But the truth was, my mind had already started drifting. There was someone else I couldn't get out of my head. It all started a few months ago at a work conference. I met Brian, Jason's colleague, and a man I had heard about but never actually met. He was tall, with a rugged look and an easy smile that seemed to draw people in. He wasn't my type at first, but there was something about him that I couldn't ignore. Something magnetic. We ended up sitting next to each other at dinner, and I remember feeling an instant connection. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper. He was funny, confident, and easy to talk to. Our conversation flowed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was seen in a way I hadn't been in years. When we talked about our personal lives, he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me beyond just the surface. The night wore on, and we had a few drinks. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were standing on the hotel balcony alone. It was late. Everyone else was either heading to bed or still inside, but we were out there, talking under the stars. There was this tension in the air between us. An undeniable chemistry that neither of us could ignore. Brian stepped closer to me, his hand grazing mine as he leaned in. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. And then, without thinking, we kissed. It was nothing wild, just a soft, lingering kiss. But it felt like a spark had ignited inside me. It felt real. And raw. And everything I hadn't realized I was missing. We pulled apart quickly. Both of us a little shocked by what had just happened. But neither of us did anything. I just smiled, trying to act like it was no big deal. But I knew. I knew this was something more than just a passing moment. And as I went back to my room that night, the reality hit me hard. What I had just done. And how easily I had let it happen. The next day, things were awkward. Brian avoided eye contact. And I could feel the weight of that kiss hanging between us. But when I saw him at the conference later, he smiled and gave me a subtle nod like nothing had happened. And maybe in his mind it hadn't. But for me, it was impossible to forget. I went home to Jason the next day, carrying this secret that was eating me alive. I tried to push it to the back of my mind. Jason was happy to see me, and I didn't want to ruin our time together. But I couldn't stop thinking about Brian. And when he sent me a text the following week, asking how I was doing, and if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, I couldn't ignore it. That coffee date led to more. We started texting, talking more often, meeting up for lunch during the workday. Each time we saw each other, the connection deepened. Brian knew how to make me feel special, how to make me laugh, how to make me feel alive in a way that Jason hadn't in a long time. As the weeks went by, it became harder to separate the two worlds, my marriage to Jason and my growing emotional connection to Brian. Every time Jason came home from work, I would smile, kiss him, and go through the motions, pretending everything was fine. But in my mind, I was already somewhere else. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the excitement. I wanted to be with Brian. I wanted to explore what this thing between us could be. But every time I looked at Jason, I felt this crushing weight in my chest. I loved him, I did. But I wasn't sure that was enough anymore. And now here I was on this weekend getaway with Jason, supposed to be reconnecting, but all I could think about was Brian. I tried to push the thoughts of him aside, tried to focus on Jason, on us. We went for a hike, we had dinner, and we even managed to laugh together a few times. But every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like if I was somewhere else. With Brian. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Something had to give. The guilt was overwhelming, but the attraction to Brian was undeniable. That night, after Jason had fallen asleep, I stared out the window at the moonlight reflecting off the mountains. My mind racing. Was I ready to face the truth? Was I ready to confront my own heart and decide what I really wanted? The answer wasn't clear yet, but as I lay there in the dark, I knew this weekend would change everything. The next morning, I woke up early just before the sun started rising. Jason was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I quietly slipped out of bed, grabbed a blanket, and stepped out onto the cabin's porch. The cold mountain air hit me immediately, the sharp chill cutting through the thin fabric of my pajamas. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and leaned against the wooden railing, trying to clear my mind. The night before had been a blur. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable, the thoughts of Brian racing through my head. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so torn. The guilt was suffocating. And yet, I felt alive in a way that I hadn't in years. Jason and I used to have this connection, a bond that felt unbreakable. But now, it felt like we were both just going through the motions. I loved him, but I couldn't deny that something was missing. That something was Brian. I tried to push the thoughts of him aside, but they kept creeping back in, demanding my attention. Was I wrong to want this? To feel this pull towards someone else? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center myself. I couldn't keep living in this duality. Caught between my loyalty to Jason and the overwhelming attraction I felt for Brian, something had to change. I needed to decide. Jason stirred inside, and I could hear him calling my name softly from the bedroom. "Morning," I answered, trying to sound normal, trying to sound like everything was okay. I heard him move around, and a few moments later, he stepped onto the porch, yawning as he joined me by the railing. "Cold out here, huh?" he said, his voice still thick with sleep. I nodded, trying to focus on the view instead of a storm brewing inside me. The mountains were stunning, the trees stretching as far as the eye could see. The early morning light casting long shadows across the ground, but it felt like I was looking at it all through a fog. Jason stood next to me for a moment, and I could feel the distance between us. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. He didn't know it, but I was already slipping away from him. "You okay?" Jason asked, his voice laced with concern. "You seem distant." I forced a smile, turning to face him. "Yeah, just thinking." He looked at me for a moment, his brow furrowed. He was always so intuitive, always able to read me even when I didn't say anything. But this time, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. "You sure you're okay?" he pressed, reaching out to touch my arm. "You know, if something's on your mind, we can talk about it." I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him how I felt about Brian, how my emotions were all over the place, and how confused I was. But I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The truth felt too painful, too dangerous. If I told him, I didn't know what would happen next. I wasn't sure I even wanted to know. Instead, I just nodded again, forcing the smile to stay on my face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just need some fresh air," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason seemed to buy it. He leaned in to kiss me on the cheek, and I let him, even though it felt hollow. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area around the cabin. Jason was in his element, talking about all the places he wanted to go, the adventures he wanted to have. But my mind kept drifting back to Brian. I couldn't stop thinking about him. How he made me feel alive. How every time he texted me, my heart raced with excitement. By mid-afternoon, Jason suggested we head back to the cabin for some downtime. As we walked back, I could feel the tension between us growing. There was something unspoken in the air. Once we were inside, Jason made us some coffee, and we sat together on the couch. It was quiet, almost too quiet. My thoughts were still a whirlwind, and I couldn't stop the feelings of guilt that kept rising up. I knew I was hurting Jason. I knew I was betraying him, even if nothing physical had happened yet. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I was emotionally checked out. At that moment, my phone burst on the coffee table. I picked it up without thinking, and saw that it was a message from Brian. My heart skipped a beat as I read his text. *K, I've been thinking about you. Hope your weekend's going okay. Would love to see you again soon. I felt a surge of excitement, followed by a wave of guilt. Jason had seen the message light up on my phone, and I knew he was watching me closely. But I couldn't stop the flush that rose to my cheeks. It was a reminder of a life I was leading, a life with Jason, and the secret I was keeping. "Who is that?" Jason asked, his voice casual but with an edge of suspicion. I hesitated for a moment before putting my phone down. "Just a work thing." Jason raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything more. We sat there in silence.